All right. And welcome back, guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. Yeah, we are doing things a little bit differently today. Today, we are covering a topic that I'm very, like you guys know already, I'm very passionate about, and that is how to get stage lean. And if you recall, I did a webinar on this in October, which time of recording this, that was just this past week. I did a webinar and a lot of you guys came out, a lot of you guys attended. The feedback on that, was just overwhelming. It was really nice to see that so many of you who are not in the bodybuilding space found value in what was covered. And really that's where, the motivation came to turn this into a podcast episode. Because I figure, why not? It needs to be recorded anyway. I feel like these are principles that at any point in your career, it's nice to go back through and kind of refresh and just make sure that, hey, like you're not missing the mark on very easy things. So that is what we're doing today. I'm going to take you through a principles-based approach on how to get stage lean, how I got stage lean. And for those of you who don't know, conditioning has been something that historically I've just put myself kind of in this box of like, well, I don't get conditioned as easily as I'd like. I really struggle with that. Conditioning has always been a sore subject, really up until the last season. Yeah, the season before that, even then, 2021. This was the season that I turned pro. I competed at Junior USA's. I won the overall. But I'll tell you, like the design itself of this prep was not good. Like it was just, for all intents and purposes, it was just very poorly designed, poorly executed. It was just balls to the wall. Just, hey, just get as much as you can, go as far as you can, as fast as you can. And I think a lot of people would assume that, just given that I did well at that first show, I turned pro, did really well. And then I competed at my pro show, did extremely well. Also, people would assume that the prep was optimal, that it was well thought out, that it was perfectly executed. And in reality, when I got to the end of the season, I was very burnt out. I was very much at the tail end where I was like, I can't keep going. And even if I could have physically, I couldn't because I was injured. I suffered a pretty serious injury. I tore my serratus when I was posing, of all things. It just extended duration of being over dieted, under recovered, had negative estrogen at that point, and was doing a lot, was just very spread thin. Posed a little too hard. And within the course of a few days, my whole right side, it was my right serratus, so my whole right side, I have pictures, maybe I'll throw them up, maybe I won't, but essentially I couldn't really ventilate, I couldn't inhale or exhale without like significant pain. Really any kind of expansion at the rib cage, any kind of twisting. It made posing like damn near impossible. I still continued and I did 2 shows at the tail end of that season because I just felt like I don't know what the repercussions are at the pro level if I pull out of these shows. And frankly, I don't want to chance it having just done well, having just started, competing as a pro. So I competed at those 2 shows, but I was in a grimy place afterwards. And we fast forward, we look at the following year. These are the physical differences of, being roughly a week out ish. At, this one on 21 was my pro debut. The one on the right was my 4th pro show. But you can see there are significant improvements in the conditioning and the muscularity. And this was in just a year's time. And a lot of you would probably assume that I was like very enhanced on the right and not so enhanced on the left. But what I can tell you is that like from a drug perspective, very different protocols, very, very different protocols, very different preps as a whole. In 21, there was no thoughtfulness really that went into, from start to finish, like, how am I going to get on stage? How much weight do I need to lose? I made sure on the following season after that, I coached myself. I had John Jewett in my corner as my second eye. I took a very systematic approach to getting on stage. And really, it came down to I ended that season with such, like, I don't want to say discouragement, but I was very much of the belief, I was like, there's no way this is the best way to go about getting on stage. And I was very much motivated to figure out how to find a better way. And that's exactly what I did. I think when we really parse out what exactly is preventing someone from getting as conditioned as they want to, and being able to present that on the bodybuilding stage, too much fat, not enough time, not enough muscle, and a lack of experience. And I mean, there are intricacies into why one might occur as opposed to another. But in actuality, I mean, like, it does come down to these, 4 to 8 fundamental aspects that if you are aware of, I mean, you can certainly set yourself up to have the best chance of getting as conditioned as you need to be. When we look at like lack of experience, lack of skill, these are ones that might take multiple preps in order to really foster and figure out, okay, what is the best way for me to sit through the discomfort that comes with getting stage lean. Whereas then when we look at like food reporting, poor food adherence, these are ones that are a little more actionable that can be corrected pretty easily. But when we look at these 4, too much fat, not enough time, not enough muscle, and starting too slow, these are ones that you kind of, I would say like the first 3, too much fat, not enough time, not enough muscle. These are ones that in advance. You can readily predict hey, is this too much fat? And if it is, then I shouldn't start prep. Do I have enough time? No, I don't. So I shouldn't start prep. Do I have enough muscle? And if I don't have enough muscle, is this something that thereby I'm going to have to compensate and get overly conditioned in order to bring the visibility that I need to the required body parts? Those are all ones that, generally I would say most people can determine before ever starting a prep. Starting too slow, once you're past the first 4 to 6 weeks, you just miss the boat. And it's great if you catch it the first week and you're like, hey, you know what, that week, not a lot happened, but I'm going to pick it up this next week and really ensure that I don't fall any further behind. But we're going to go through each of these. But first, when we look at where I was in 2021, so this was my pro debut. Objectively, I, kind of went into this already. I did very well, but the prep itself was not structured well. I did well for a lot of reasons, but looking back, I definitely think that I overextended myself in a lot of ways in which I could have avoided doing so. I don't think that it was necessary to be in the deficits that I was in. I don't think it was necessary to use the drugs that I did. The cardio was insane. And really, I think a lot of people assume, and this is one of the bigger fallacies within the sport of competing, is that if you do well on paper, then that inherently means that your prep was designed extremely well. Not always the case. And I would say more often than not, there's a lot of people who find success on the bodybuilding stage who went about prep in a very reckless manner. So what exactly was it? This is where I think, I know I went wrong. I crashed into my shows. The first show, I didn't really know if I was going to be lean enough. And realistically, I went into it 2 weeks out. I was still 7 pounds above where I thought I was going to be at that point. And I was this is kind of ridiculous. I've been dieting and I came off of prep. How did this even happen? In reality, I was too fat and I didn't have enough time. Context to that too, but I won't go down into all of that right now. I had 22 pounds to lose, which in the course of 10 weeks, that was a very, very aggressive deficit. At peak, I was doing 2 hours of cardio a day. Calories were extremely low. And, even at one point, my coach asked me at the time, he's like, how how low can you actually go with food? And in my mind, I was like, okay, do you mean like fast? Because if that's the case, like we're 2 days out from the show. Like, why do I have to have no, like, that's insane. And like I said, the drug protocol, it didn't make a lot of sense. It wasn't outrageous. It wasn't the worst that I've seen, especially now at this point, but it wasn't thought out. Like there were a lot of things that I definitely could have had in place that would have helped me. And a lot of things that were in place that weren't helping me. So when we really break it down into like, what are the things that you need to set yourself up to have the best season possible, to have the best probability of getting as conditioned as you need to, or in other words, how to not miss your conditioning. This starts with having a timeline that is designed and to have a very clear idea of where you're headed, because you can't measure what isn't managed. You can't manage what isn't measured. Actually, no, that's how I want to say that. That is the correct way for that to go. And without like a pretty definitive idea of like, okay, this is roughly the amount of body fat I need to lose, you're kind of just shooting in the dark. And it's not to say that like you're gonna know, to the exact pound, especially if you're a first-time competitor or you're less experienced or you've never gotten stage lean. These are all reasons that would lend to the fact that like you might be guessing, but without a timeline built out, and I know it's like all cool right now to be like, ooh, I don't use spreadsheets, I just use WhatsApp. Okay, we get it. You're so cool. I am not impressed by like winging it, getting lucky, and then being like, see, I told you, it worked. It's like, yeah, but how many times did it not work? And was there a better way to do it? I would much rather have the data and be able to look back then after the fact and be like, okay, this is roughly how long it took to get to this mile marker within this prep, and if we're doing a true like performance review of like how successful the prep was, that does encompass like, could it have been executed better, like more effectively? Could you have been more efficient with the fat loss? It's really easy to fall behind without a proper timeline. And this is also integrating into the second principle, which is making sure that you create your deficit correctly. And yes, there are shades of gray to doing so, but how you create your deficit can be very costly. And I think a lot of people assume that as long as you're in the deficit, it doesn't matter whether or not you do this via cardio, whether you do it just by cutting food. Ultimately, this needs to be something that makes sense based on how much body fat you have to lose and how much you can actually recover from. High adherence. This is a given, but I think is something that a lot of people, they lose sight of because they think, well, as long as I just make up for it, it doesn't matter if I take any steps backwards. You don't see a lot of people get spotty with adherence and then are able to come back from it. It just doesn't happen very often. And this is something that I would say, like, as soon as I begin to see slip in a contest prep, I'm usually like, okay, realistically, unless we're like right there at the tail end, we need to assess whether or not it makes sense to continue prepping. But having a high rate of adherence, that is a cornerstone. That is like fundamental in making sure that you are able to get stage lean. Now, how you monitor, assess, audit, course correct ultimately is going to be dependent on the execution and what actually occurs. But the idea being, if you're following this approach, then you should be able to work efficiently using these principles, knowing that, okay, there's going to be some deviations from that target rate of change, and they're going to require modifying maybe the type of deficit you're in, the degree of a deficit you're in, or how quickly or slowly we push this. But having the ability to make logical, not emotional, non-irrational decisions that are not rooted in anxiety or stress, that ultimately is going to be key to getting stage lean. Because really, when you look at like the first pillar, we're talking about just building out a plan, like building out a trajectory over the course of 3 to 4 months. And without that timeline being designed, you really are just guessing. Now, why is this an issue? Why shouldn't you just guess? especially when we're talking about someone who has a lot of weight to lose. So if you are that person who has 20, 25 pounds to lose, not planning in advance, gosh, that's just a quick way to put you in a position where you do have to take extreme measures. And you do have to prescribe to these excessive deficits. I mean, like I'm talking over 1,000 calorie deficit a day. I'm probably needing to sustain drops of 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds per week the entire way through. And even then it's like questionable if you're going to be ready on time. This also sets you up to ultimately have a lot of stress. I mean, if you are at all human, you're more than likely going to be stressed out as you get closer to that show because you're not going to know whether you're going to be ready in time. And like going into my show, I very much had concerns around like, should I even get on the plane? Like, is this even worth it? And yeah, on paper, I did well. But I was very much stressed out even up until the night before, the morning of. I'm like, I don't have the confidence that I'm actually as lean as I need to be because this was such a rush. And that ultimately is what we want to avoid. That is the purpose of a timeline, to make the look better. And creating your timeline, it doesn't have to be challenging. It can be pretty straightforward. It can be pretty simplistic, actually. All you have to do is start with the total amount of weight you have to lose. And like I said, if you are someone who has not been stage lean in the past, maybe you do need to overshoot and you need to consider like a 5-pound range lower than what you're aiming for, just so that if you get to that initial target, maybe you're like, okay, this still isn't lean enough, but you still have the wiggle room and you didn't plan to just hit that initial marker. You planned to shoot 5 pounds past that. Now, with that being said, how much weight is acceptable? Like, what's the max? What are we capping it out at? Is like, how much weight in totality can you lose? Really, I'm going to say past like 15%. It starts to get dicey. And it's not to say this is like a hard set in stone rule, but you do need to have some kind of ceiling established because otherwise you would just gain indefinitely and be like, oh, I'll just lose 50 pounds to get on stage. I wouldn't recommend that. I think really when we're talking about, in the case of someone who, has 20 pounds to lose, this is really like 20 to 30 pounds. That's like right at the upper end of what I would say is reasonable. And really we have to consider like, if we're losing, 20 to 30 pounds to get to that target weight for show, are we doing so because we have a lack of muscularity that ultimately we're compensating for? Because if that's the case, we have a solution built into a problem. Now, when we talk about duration, how long should you spend dieting? This is where looking at that total net weight loss that needs to come off, we can simply divide this up over the course of the amount of weeks that you have to diet. And I mean, like I'm kind of getting ahead here, but we don't want that duration to really go past 30 or so weeks. And I would even say like 25 to 30, 25 of like true dieting. But typically I'm someone who's like, hey, we should have like a 2 to 3 week buffer kind of built in throughout. So maybe weeks like 6, 7, 8, one of these weeks we should have as a diet break. Maybe we should aim to be stage lean roughly 2 weeks before the show. That way, if we're dragging our feet, or if towards the tail end things get hard, you get sick, you're just not losing at the rate that you thought you would be, you have a little bit of buffer. And I can tell you the amount of people that like I've worked with who like are very adherent, they're very good at what they do, they're hardworking, but they need that final 2 weeks. They still need that because shit happens. Like it didn't go as perfectly as they hoped. That's what I would cap it out at. 25 to 30 weeks, especially on the lower side, 20 to 25. If you're like, hey, I'm going to do multiple shows and it's going to span out over the course of another 5 weeks, that'd be my recommendation. Now, how do we break this up? Finding your daily deficit simply comes down to taking that net weight loss, dividing it pretty evenly over the number of weeks you're going to spend dieting. So total duration minus the number of weeks that are not in a deficit. And then assessing, okay, what is the amount of pounds that I need to lose per week? And if 1 pound lost means that I need to be 3,500 calories under a maintenance, if I need to, in order to burn 1 pound, we need to lose 3,500 calories. We need to be in a 500 calorie deficit a day. Well, is that feasible? Is that reasonable? Or is the amount that I'm going to have to be in a deficit, am I looking at 2-ish pounds every single week in order to hit that stage weight? Because if that's the case, then that ultimately tells us that you might be starting prep a little too heavy, which ultimately it brings me to the next point, which is like, how quickly should we be getting into contest prep? And this is one that kind of irks me, because I think a lot of people are under the impression that like, well, I don't want to lose muscle, so I don't want to go like straight into prep and like rip it just like immediately week 1, week 2. Like I kind of want to like warm up into it. And I think this is a huge error, because ultimately when we look at when fat loss is the hardest versus when it's the easiest, we know that being in a deficit, sustaining weight loss, that is going to be the most challenging and most difficult to do when fatigue is high, when willpower is low, when cortisol is high, and when you are under a time crunch. Now, notice how everything I just described, that is essentially the state we're in at the end of contest prep. I mean, you are pretty much burnt out at that point for most people. Some people, you get the rare exception where you're like, hey, this was a cakewalk. It was pretty easy, actually. Amazing. I wouldn't expect that, especially if it's your first time getting this conditioned or if it's your first show. So if we know that realistically fat loss is the hardest at the end of prep, by proxy, when is it the easiest? At the beginning. This is when fatigue should be lower, willpower should be higher, cortisol should generally be lower at this point, because you shouldn't be coming off a fat loss phase. And ideally, you're not stressed out, like mentally, you're not in a place where you're doubting whether or not you're going to be ready. If that's the case, you should definitely reevaluate the timeline. Now, once you get into prep, assuming that we like go in and we're like, okay, first 4 to 6 weeks, we're not going to dick around. We're going to adhere to our target rate of loss. What happens if we're not seeing that target rate of loss? What happens if we get into those first 2 weeks, it's not a big enough deficit, or even worse, it is a deficit that we're like, this should absolutely work, but for whatever reason, we start to notice weight is not dropping. Is this a stall? What do we need to do? What do we need to do in order to ensure we're still moving in the right direction, that we're not falling behind? So this is where we need to determine whether or not what we're saying on the scale weight, and I would definitely recommend tracking your scale weight 7 days a week, looking at then the average of those 7 data points, and then consider the high versus the low and compare that to previous weeks to see if that is on par with the pattern that you've been experiencing. Now, not many people are going to see a linear trajectory in weight loss, even if you are 100% adherent. And I say this more specifically to females, like female athletes. It's more than likely going to be the case that you experience artificial inflations, meaning you are going to have aspects of your program, of moving variables that frankly you don't have a lot of control over. Some you have more control than others, but we have to actively be able to identify whether or not the inflations we're seeing on the scale, the stalls, are truly artificial. We need to be able to assess, is the data being muddied by any of the following things? Now, really simple, anything that's going to affect scale weight. So you got to think anything related to fluid balance, anything related to sodium, hydration, all going to have pretty significant and very acute impacts on scale weight. So if you're seeing that like you're not as regular, consistent, and you're also noting that this tends to correlate when you have higher sodium meals, it certainly could be something to consider, is like whether or not it's worth controlling sodium intake in order to create continuity, ultimately aiding in better decision making. Recovery score. Hydration status, yes, related to sodium, but just generally hydration status, that's going to affect GI weight. It's going to affect whether or not you're able to use the bathroom regularly, which ultimately this can also muddy that data. Now, I brushed over this just a second ago, but recovery. So think about anything that relates to dropping off dietary fatigue. So decreased sleep, even an increase in training. This can lead to obviously being in an under-recovered state, which ultimately could lead to you holding more water on your frame. I mean, when we get into GI weight, like this is one that a lot of people, they will get kind of caught up in like, well, did I have the same amount of volume day to day? And if you're following a meal plan, it's very likely that you are having the same amounts of foods like in weight every single day. But if you're a little more flexible with your diet, this absolutely can impact total GI weight. And if you're not using the restroom and like excreting, like disposing of the same amount of waste every single day, this can absolutely skew that data point. But we also have to consider like fiber intake, food selection. Different things have different profiles, different foods have different macronutrient profiles, which ultimately might slow down or speed up digestion. And all of these things can be affected by probably the number one contributor to artificial inflations, which are hormonal fluctuations. So if you are someone who, like clockwork, you notice like week 3 of your cycle, you notice between days 21 and 28, that is when you experience the hormonal flux. You notice that no matter how adherent you are, no matter if you cut carbs, if you drink a ton of water, if you don't work out, you just store water weight, you just hold on to water weight. This is a critical note to make and to consider before modifying the diet, modifying the deficit, because we may see, it could very well be the case that we see the following week that there's an even bigger drop off. However, the cost, the potential risk of not modifying the diet, thinking that it's a hormonal fluctuation, is that if that weight doesn't drop off, well, then now at this point we have to compensate because now we're a week behind. This is where it's really important to ensure that you are tracking your cycle. If you have an idea of generally when you experience these symptoms related to PMS, and realistically, we should be able to have this data and we should be able to reference it from points prior to starting contest prep. What about lab work? Because this is one that I think a lot of people, they get caught up in its impact, really your hormones impact, on your ability to get stage lean, and whether or not this is something that we need to monitor for in and outside of contest prep. Now, I'll say for the most part, I don't think that it's warranted. I don't think that we need to necessarily keep a tight, close eye on lab work during a prep. And I know that probably sounds wild, but realistically, we should have an idea before prep where you are to begin with. And wherever you are, we can reasonably assume that it's likely that these hormones are going to be suppressed once in a state of contest prep. Now, when do I like to get lab work? I would say anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks prior to starting prep. This is going to give us insight into whether or not we can expect this prep to be easier or whether or not we can expect it to be harder. This is going to also tell us whether or not we should reasonably consider using fat loss tools maybe a little bit sooner into a fat loss phase, into your contest prep. Essentially, it gives us this baseline that we can then work off of. And even though we can expect hormones to be down-regulated going into prep, it's important to know that if they're already down-regulated, we can expect some delay, and we may need to account for this when we design the timeline. Now, the other times really I would suggest getting lab work is around 4 to 6 weeks post-show. And I know some people will be like, well, don't we want to get them the week of? Like, isn't it important to know, like, critically, like, how dysregulated are we? And it's like, yeah, I mean, like, it's not worthless. I mean, the one thing I try to be cognizant of is like labs can be expensive. And if getting the labs is not going to change what we're doing, like if there's going to be no secondary action due to those results, then I don't necessarily think it's worth it. And at the end of prep, like we're already going to be doing something that ideally is going to improve those markers, which is gaining body fat, dropping off fatigue, lowering cardio, increasing food. So in turn, it's like we can see what kind of state we're in, but ultimately we know that at the 4 to 6 week mark, that's roughly when we should see some degree of improvement. And outside of this, I mean, like I really do want to see at the point, the 12 to 16 week mark post-contest, this is where I want to assess like what residual deficiencies are present. And for most people, frankly, this is the point where we're kind of having that decision-making process on, are we using anabolics? Are we going back into contest prep? What does that look like for the preceding year? Are we going to be dieting for the same amount of time, less time, longer? And it's around this point that I really want to get my affairs in order. I want to know, okay, if we're going to be using anabolics, are we in a position to fully take advantage of them? Can we map out the remaining growth phase with where hormones are currently at? Or do we need to be a little bit more aggressive with getting them back to normal? Now, obviously, the other time I want to really consider lab work is when we're using those results to diagnose or to treat some kind of manifestation, some kind of complaint. If there's a chief complaint that could be related to a hormonal imbalance or, a system disorder, it would make sense at that point to get labs just to have as a reference point, as well as whether or not we're beginning like HRT or any kind of pharmacological therapy that ultimately we need to know serum levels in order to titrate up or down. How we create the deficit absolutely matters. And I think I was very naive to this concept in 2021. I was given the option by my coach to create the deficit using cardio or by lowering food. And because inherently I was very nervous about being at low food for that long, I went into it and I'm like, yeah, let's push the cardio. And I continued, as he gave me the option, I continued to push that. I'm like, yeah, let's do the cardio. And at a certain point, food wasn't even under, I think it was 1,400, 1,500. And I was doing 90 minutes of cardio a day. And that's something that I think a lot of people, they miscalculate how much of an impact cardio actually is going to be. And on the inverse side of this, I know there's a lot of people who they'll be very resistant to add cardio in because they just don't enjoy doing it. They feel like they're really not able to recover at this point, yet they continue to dig themselves into this dietary hole where eventually they're eating very low calories just to sustain doing a low amount of cardio. And sure, if it's necessitated, if it's the way that this individual needs to create the deficit, that's one thing. But when we're talking about just preference, we need to find some equilibrium in how we're creating the deficit and understand the risk and the cost of creating it one way as opposed to another. So when we look at really a 5-step process on creating this deficit, the big things here are going to be making sure that there is a high degree of accuracy in food reporting. This is absolutely essential and noted earlier within those pillars of getting contest lean, getting stage lean, food reporting, food adherence, that needs to be dialed in, and we need to be able to do this repeatedly. Now, past this, creating that deficit, one of the avenues I think a lot of people aren't capitalizing on is exploiting your step count. And I think this is an area that overall is much less fatiguing than structured cardio, than doing the stairs, than doing incline treadmill. And I think if I'm being honest, this was one that I wasn't really consistent with monitoring despite, doing so much structured cardio. So it's maybe at the beginning of prep, my steps were 12,000, 15,000 because I was very motivated and very excited about getting leaner. But then what happened over the next several months? As I became more tired, I stopped going on walks at night. I stopped parking a little bit further away from wherever I was going to. I would find ways to inadvertently reduce the amount of activity I was doing on a regular basis, which ultimately that dropped my step count pretty low, which that activity, even though it's not going to be as great as the calorie burn that you get from simply doing cardio, it's still something that adds up. And if we're not keeping a ready eye on what that flux is over the course of contest prep, you can easily lose 6,000, 7,000 steps from what your normal is without even realizing it. Now, the other aspect to this is exploiting recovery, because when it comes to hunger signaling, I really think this is the area that I guess it falls under the umbrella of fatigue management is if you want to manage the fatigue, the dietary fatigue that comes with eating very little food, you really have to consider what tools we have to drop off that dietary fatigue while in prep, because the two most common tools that can be readily accessed would either be increasing food or getting more sleep. I mean, obviously doing less activity, but in the case of someone who has a set amount of structured cardio to do per day in a training session, it's okay, we really only have the food intake, which arguably we can't really go past if we're trying to be adherent and we're trying to lose body fat. So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with looking at our sleep patterns, making sure that we are doing everything we can to maximize how much rest we're getting every night. And even within the sense of like, okay, looking at activity level and being very cognizant of like, how much activity am I doing that's unnecessary? How much can I streamline the additional non-exercise activity that I'm doing? And would I actually benefit from taking more time to recover on a regular basis? And this was something that really allowed me to get more out of my efforts, my last prep. Now, I kind of already touched on this, and I mean, the last two I'm kind of combining, but leveraging cardio with respect to its cost. So understanding that, the cost of doing cardio as opposed to lowering food, they're not equitable. And there's even secondary cost of picking specific modalities of cardio that can be even more taxing, which is why I was that person, and very much she was like, okay, like I'm just going to keep pushing up cardio, and then that's going to allow me to eat more, and then I won't feel as bad. But there's a point where that just simply isn't true. So approaching creating your deficit with this in mind, that like, okay, cardio is going to ultimately impact my training performance because it's going to be utilizing the available resources, the calories, in order to get through these sessions. Now, what does that leave me with going into my training sessions? Not a lot. So if we can keep cardio not necessarily completely out of contest prep, I think that's very unrealistic. But if we can keep it only to what is the minimum effective dose for us to have in place so that we can still capitalize on these training sessions and ultimately help us better retain muscle, this is going to be better in the long run for the look that we're trying to bring to stage. So I think the primary issue, at least in my case, like why I put myself in that position where I was doing so much cardio and very resistant to eating food, is I didn't understand this concept. And that is the actual units of energy, like the calories itself, those do not change the leaner you get. Like a calorie is still a calorie. It still has the same composition depending on the macronutrient profile. Now, cardio ultimately becomes more costly the leaner you get because you have less available resources like physically on your body to support that recovery. Now, this becomes especially true when you pair this with dietary fatigue, which ultimately we can assume that you're going to experience at the tail end of a contest prep. Intake, your calories going in, it's a fixed expense. And I think this is where if we're trying to create an accurate deficit, if we're trying to create a deficit that we can readily say, like, this is a 500 calorie deficit, this is a 700 calorie deficit, the way to go about doing this with the most precision is going to be doing it largely through modifying intake as opposed to just looking at output and trying to run up the clock here. With cardio, as fatigue accumulates, output does become more costly, and it might very much require more real or perceived effort just to do the exact same amount of duration. So when I look at intake versus output and we're making decisions, I mean, really, we have to make these decisions respective to the ceiling that we plan to avoid, to stop at for each of these sectors. So when it comes to calories in, I mean, like very much, I don't think that there's any sense like that 800 to 1,000 calorie range. I think it's going to be tough to make an argument unless someone's very petite to go under that. And although I know there's some people that are like, hey, well, like I'll do whatever it takes. Like, what if it's just for a day? I'll do 500 or 600. It's like, okay, but even if you're really small, it's like, what is the cost of going this low? Now with cardio, obviously this is relative to the intensity, but doing 60 minutes a day, like really past that. And I have to question, like, why are we so far behind that we need to have, 75, 90 minutes a day? And I mean, realistically, like, yes, I myself, I've been there. Yes, I've had clients who've had to go to that, but for extended durations, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The big things that you need to ensure you're aware of as you're setting up your contest prep. Have you allocated enough time? And really this comes down to taking the information from before, your total net weight that you need to lose, as well as the duration that you have or the duration that you would need to be able to sustain a rate of change between 0.8% and 1.5. And I would say for most people, 1% is still going to be very aggressive, especially if they're over like 130 pounds. But this is definitely one of those things that's like, if you start early and you capitalize on the time you have when fat loss is going to be easiest, you can get ahead and you can make up for some of that rate of loss that you're committing to towards the later ends of prep. But I would say realistically, like pushing yourself past a deficit of like 800 calories a day for extended durations, I feel like for most people, this is going to be problematic and likely unsustainable. So then we need to consider, is the net loss reasonable? Does the total net loss exceed 15%? And like I've started preps where I'm like about 140 and I've gotten to about 120. A total net change of 20 pounds. And I think when we're talking about muscle preservation, we really have to consider like when we're pushing past 15% into the 20%, what is the likelihood that we're going to be able to retain muscle, losing this much body fat, getting so far away from our initial starting point? And how much are we going to have to untangle once we come out of that show? Really, the big things for me, I want to make sure that athletes are capitalizing on the first 4 weeks. Commit to that weekly rate of change. Don't drag your feet. I know a lot of people, they want to start slow and then really get into it. And then once they feel like they're a little bit more motivated, a little leaner, I can see the visibility, that's when they're going to turn it on. I don't recommend that. I recommend starting out the gate strong, committing to that rate of change, trusting the data, and really utilizing that pre-prep period to work out the kinks. Now, if you're someone who's repeatedly under your target rate of change, and you know that it's not an artificial inflation, this is where I would consider creating more of a deficit. And how you create the deficit ultimately is going to determine your success related to your ability to maintain muscle mass. Now, individuals who only pull on one lever as opposed to both of them systematically, I don't see this panning out well for many individuals. So if you're someone who's like very antsy about like, I don't want food to go below this threshold, yet you're very much willing and excited or eager to do more cardio to preserve food, it's like, okay, you can maybe do this to some degree. You can maybe get away with a little bit of a buffer, maybe in early stages, but there's going to be a point where this catches up to you and ultimately bites you in the ass. I would do your best to anticipate individualized bottlenecks and really try to detach from numerical values as to what like mentally you can handle while in a contest prep. I think ultimately the key to being successful and actually getting as lean as you need to is creating an environment where the things that you need to do are easier and the things that make it hard to do the things you need to do are less prevalent. Now, your environment is going to determine your success. And to some extent, you're only going to have so much control over what you can do. But I do think in the essence of getting conditioned, it is as simple as preparing and setting up a good trajectory for you to follow and then pivoting and adjusting as needed. But very much this is one of those things for the longest time I didn't believe I could do. I thought there was secrets to it. I thought there was a facade around like, I guess there is a facade. I thought there was like this allure that like you have to do it in this, fashion that has all of these hoops and tricks. And frankly, I think the more and more that I've spent time, and in reality, what I've found is that it's much less sexy and it's much less exciting. And that realistically, the best way to go about getting stage lean, in my experience, is to have all of the information at the beginning and to use it to your advantage. I hope this was helpful. I hope you guys enjoyed the webinar. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.